I was ordained at 27 and unmade by 33. And if there is a single hinge on which my life turned, it was a door iron-ribbed, unnumbered, and hidden behind a tapestry whose saints had no eyes. I can still feel the nap of the wool under my fingers, hot with the friction of my own nerves as I lifted it, as if I were peeling back an eyelid from a sleeping giant. I did not know then that opening the door would not simply lead me somewhere else. It would change the grammar of my memory. It would change my sense of what a night is and how many hours a day can truly contain. You might expect miracles to introduce themselves with trumpets. In Rome, they prefer paperwork. The men who schooled me in piety were men of forms and signatures, men who could fold 9 kinds of silence into a manila folder and call it prudence. They taught me that the archives, never secret, mind you, merely apostolic, and for the custodian's use, were a garden of memory. A pleasant phrase that falls off the tongue like a prayer. But gardens have walls, and walls imply 2 things: what is kept out and what is locked in. I became an obedient gardener. I learned the choreography of handling vellum without leaving fingerprints, how to kiss a spine with smoke so the leather drinks a little life and loosens. I learned which titles to index, which to route through the polite oblivion of special holdings, and which to ask no questions about at all. I knew where the reliquaries gleamed, where the catalogers argued in hand signals over whether a margin note was scholium or heresy. I knew the hours when the guards dozed and the basilica breathed, a sleeping animal so large you could only see it by the way the light shivered in the dust. It was a hot night, and Rome was all stone and rumor. The basilica exhaled warmth, as if digesting centuries. I had been cataloging a batch of chained books, libri catenati, the ones that wore their cautions openly when the bell in the south transept hiccuped and gave me the hour wrong. Such hiccups are common in old buildings, they said. The air itself forgets how to carry the sound, yet the number clung to me. 12, and something left over. 12, with a tremor. 12, with an afterthought. I glanced at the clock above the archivist's desk, but its hands made a polite lie, as all clocks do, and in the space between its second ticks I felt a draft that had no business being there. The tapestry should have been nothing, a decorative mercy hung to warm an otherwise stern corridor. Its saints had once had eyes, I think, but they had been stitched over by a cautious hand, leaving only the faint relief of lids beneath the new thread. I told myself I was moving it to locate the draft. This is the kind of thing men tell themselves before they trespass, that someone smaller has been inconvenienced, and we are only correcting air. My fingers found the seam where the tapestry's belly lifted a fraction from the stone, and the wool hummed like a hive. Behind it, iron, ribbed like a whale's mouth, set not flush but a finger's breadth, proud of the masonry, as if the wall had grown around it reluctantly. There was no handle, there was a keyhole, and I had no key. I had the nest of keys that every obedient functionary accumulates. Bright, dull, ornate, humiliatingly ordinary. None of them belonged to this door. I pushed the iron with my palm, the way a child tests a parent's sleep. The door did not yield. The draft was subtle but certain, smelling of tallow and old coins and something else, like dried blood sanded into parchment. I told myself, this is not for you. This is not for anyone who still hopes to sleep at night without curling himself around a question. I told myself to replace the tapestry, to log my pages, to climb the stairs whose treads knew my weight by heart. Instead, I set my key ring on the floor and knelt. I tried the obvious culprits with the stubbornness of a man who thinks the world is impressed by perseverance. The teeth of each key made a patient apology in the keyhole and declined me. I do not know if the key I used next was chosen by my hand or by that subtle draft. It was a shapeless thing, a gild-smithed failure, discarded into my ring from some older ring long dissolved by time. It fit into the hole with the intimacy of recognition. When I turned it, the iron did not shout or shudder. The hinge sang like a wet violin, and the seam, that finger's breadth of reluctance between door and stone, widened not outward but inward, as if the door were undoing a small vow. I did not push. The door invited. The space behind it was not a room so much as the idea of one, a confusion of cool and warm air that made the hair on my forearms lift, the kind of air that has never quite agreed to be shared. I took one step, and then another, and the light behind me dimmed, as if the corridor, in embarrassment at my poor manners, were closing its eyes. The first stair down was too shallow for my foot. The second matched no known pattern of descent. The third seemed to expect a shorter stride than human. I learned the sequence by apology. The crypt is a patient tutor. Once you enter, it does not instruct you in facts. It adjusts your attention. Things you might have glided past if announced in daylight begin to ask small, unnerving favors. Count your breaths, for instance. I found myself doing it without deciding to. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The count a rosary with no prayers assigned. 1, 2, 3. I did not admit I was afraid. Fear is a vulgar word. In a city that has domesticated so many terrors with marble, I said I was careful. I said I was observing. I said what men say when they need to keep their shape in front of a darkness that might be able to read. The first landing opened into a corridor of shallow arches, each arch the size of a kneeling man, each shadowed as if recently vacated. Here the air turned cooler, and with it came sounds that such air traditionally carries. The little gulps of candles, the sleepy S's of old paper resettling into itself, and a rhythmic ticking like a clock that had forgotten whether it was for telling time or taking it. On a trestle table to the left, a candlestick waited with the patience of a tool. I said a short apology to whoever would later complain about wax on old wood and struck a match. The candle took the flame with hunger. Shadows organized themselves like a garrison at inspection. What I could see now was the mustering of disciplines. The archives are often misunderstood as a single dragon horde of facts. In reality, they are a parliament of methods. Here a reliquary under glass whispered church, Latin. There a tray of seals, their wax impressed with rings that commuters had once kissed without knowing. Further down, a crate of broken magnifying lenses threw enfeebled moons onto the wall. Some objects did not care to be named. A leather strap lay coiled on the second table, stippled and veined in a way that made the eyes wish to look anywhere else. Not leather, then, something that had once been taut and vital, preserved to a gloss. It was warm. Leather is not warm. I told myself that the candle was to blame. I was a grown man in a vaulted corridor, negotiating with a strap. I do not think the strap moved. I think I moved around it in a way that made my memory later insist it had coiled like a living thing. Nerves are poor stenographers. They decorate, they delete, they protect. If I am to be honest with you, as honest as a man can be with himself in a story he is telling to an audience he will never see. I must say that what I remember next is not a fact, but the way my body reacted to a sentence carved at the lip of the trestle table. It was Latin, but it was Latin arranged like a maze. Each time I read it, the verb chose a different case to govern, the object switched masks, and the sense drifted like a sandbar beneath a tide. You know the sensation when a word you have repeated too often begins to detach from its meaning and show you its skeleton? This was that sensation extended across a sentence and then a room. I closed my eyes to correct it, and felt the sentence continue inside my eyelids. I told myself to turn back. Turning back is a reasonable and mature strategy. It respects the premise that there will be a tomorrow in which one can return with permission, with colleagues, with a superior who will attach a Latin name to the thing you are afraid to name. But turning back is something you do before you have found the thing you were not meant to find. After you have found it, turning back is not retreat but denial, and the body resists it the way the tongue resists, unlearning a prayer it does not believe in. The feathered ledger lay on the third table. You may think I am using poetry to aggrandize a book. I am not. The binding was quills, goose, or swan, lacquered until the shaft gleamed like a beetle's back, their barbs tamed and interleaved into a supple armor. When my fingers hovered above it, the quills seemed to quiver against a draft I could not feel on my skin. A hinge of leather there is that word again, and again it will not stay honest, ran along its spine. I should have looked away. The safer man would have looked away, and history would have remained polite in my company. I opened the ledger at its middle, where old books often accommodate strangers. Paper has a smell that resides somewhere near the pit of the throat. It can be sweet, rancid, ecclesiastically clean, or medically indifferent. This paper smelled of warmed bone. The hand was meticulous. The ink a black that preferred not to be compared. The columns narrow and disciplined as the little streets in Trastevere, where laundry proves the existence of families. On the left, a list with a clerk's confidence, a gospel indexed under a woman's name diverted to preservation by fire, a legal instrument relettered so the same order wore a more gentle voice, a feast day shaved of an hour, to reconcile with celestial correction. On the right, a column with no title but a habit, a ledger of what had been taken in trade for these adjustments. Not money, not exactly. The entries read like a loan book, where the currency is obedience, interest paid in silence, principal collected in fear. In the margin, initials. Some I recognized. Some were letters that spelled nothing, until I leaned closer and watched my face come back to me from the ink's skin. Perhaps you have seen mirror writing in the notebooks of certain geniuses who like to talk to themselves backwards. This was not that. The ink itself was a mirror. Not shiny, not a glass, more the suggestion of a surface that might reflect if coaxed. When I bent, my reflection trembled in the bowl of an O, shook itself into a briefly coherent man, in the tail of a G, blurred and reassembled in the serifs like a face glimpsed in rippled water. The letters were not reversed. I was. The unsettling generosity of the ink was to offer me back, not as I am to others, but as I am to the page, a reader, hungry and unsteady, already rewritten by what I consumed. There is a line one crosses in any confession, the line where you stop narrating your past and your past begins to dictate the next sentence. I stood there, the candle wicking a little pool of light, the ledger open to a folio stitched in like a heart transplant. The folio's rubric was in red, so brunette you would have sworn brown, and the title, half effaced and half newly vibrant under the candle, read, Atramentum Speculare, Mirror Ink. Below it, the rite for preparing such ink, described with the bland precision men employ when their work might be mistaken for magic, and they are anxious to be called technicians. Boil the gall, draw the iron from the dust, decant by the weight of a tensor, prayer. Pour while the bell rings noon, stir anti-sunwise, allow to cool until the surface remembers your face, unbidden. I do not know what the rite expected to accomplish. I know what it accomplished in me. The ink performed not reflection, but attention. It made attentive my looking. It insisted on the reciprocity of seeing and being seen, and there in that odd congress of my face and letters conceived by hands long dead, I felt for the first time the thing I can only call enforcement. Silence wasn't sacred. It was enforced. The enforcement was not accomplished by tyrants with bats. It was accomplished by a careful bureaucracy of seeing and being seen, of pages that would willingly look back at you if, in exchange, you would accommodate their version of events. If you will permit the metaphor, the ink offered me the courtesy of my own face, provided I would consent to read the sentence the way the sentence preferred to be read. I am a coward by temperament. This has saved my life. Courage gets you a statue. Cowardice gets you older. My cowardice told me to close the ledger gently, to adopt the posture of a man discovering a small irregularity that will, in due course, be addressed by the competent office. My cowardice told me that I could survive this, as I had survived other thresholds, by naming them channels of grace and then pretending nothing had changed. I believe I would have succeeded if not for the strap. It had migrated. No, that is embellishment. I had circled the table in such a way that now it lay between me and the candle, and the light-bullied surface details out of it the way a generous noon can make a drab alley interesting. Stipple, vein, a faint bloom like the underside of a fish, a seam that remembered being pulled. My hand reached for it because the mind demands conclusion. It cannot permit a category to sit undecided. When my finger met it, cold rose up like a piece of basement flooded and then frozen. The cold had a flavor. It tasted of pennies, and of something I do not have a word for, the sensation of hearing your name pronounced correctly by a stranger you did not introduce yourself to. Words arrived in my mouth. They were not Latin. They were not quite words. They were the outline of words, the negative space of a language whose sounds are produced by rooms, not tongues. To bind the future, the outline said and did not say. Unwrite the past. To hold the flock. Shear the shepherd. I jerked my hand back, and the candle made the reliable accusation it always makes, that pain is faithless and goes out readily when embarrassed. I relit it, my match a brief star, and in the match's falter before catching, I saw on the iron door behind me the fog bloom of breath. Someone was in the corridor, or the corridor had lungs. I forced myself to act as men act, when they are certain they are watched by something that will prefer them if they remain ceremonial. I made a small bow to the ledger, as if it were an elder leaving a room. I closed it with both hands, so the quills did not snag the air. I set the candle in the center of the table so its drip would be symmetrical and irritate the next man equally, no matter which side he approached from. I picked up my key ring, I settled the tapestry back over the door, smoothing it with my palm the way one comforts a disturbed child. I began to retrace my steps. The stairs up are never the stairs down. On ascent, they had ideas about my stride and my age that they had not held on my descent. My feet argued with them. My breath lost its rosary and began to count things that had not happened yet. The air thinned as if I were climbing out of a belief. The south transept's bell, poor creature, it tries offered me 12 dignified notes, each placed like a foot on a measured stone, and then, as I reached the corridor and the new light found my face, a 13th sound, softer, like a regret it could not help. I did not look back. I did not want to see what a 13th bell does to a man's shadow. Back at the desk, the clock's hands had advanced and not advanced. Time in old buildings makes bargains with their builders, and not with you. The ledger was not in my arms, and yet my forearms bore the phantom weight of it, the way sailors feel decks moving under their feet years after they are given dry land. I placed my keys on the blotter. My fingers were smudged, and smudges are the least romantic but most persuasive kinds of evidence. The stain was not ink. It was the refusal of my skin to either absorb or reject something that had touched it. When I turned my hands under the lamp, faint letters scaled my cuticles like ivy, not spelling, not committing, simply rehearsing the idea of text on flesh. I washed in the archivist's sink, where the water tastes like the 19th century and the pipes sympathize audibly. The marks did not vanish. They chose to be less obvious. The mind does this with certain memories. It does not forget. It reassigns them to a ledger where they are booked as favors owed to the future. I dried my hands on a towel embroidered with the name of a man who had donated it to the church and later been erased from all public lists for reasons that, in the index, read administrative realignment. What a gentle sentence. What a short bridge over a deep water. I wish I could tell you that I slept. I wish I could tell you that I woke with a clear plan to report my breach, to confess the bravado of my curiosity, to turn the matter over to men older and colder who would explain that I had embellished, as young men do, the solemn but harmless eccentricities of storerooms. What I did instead was go back the next night and the night after, because a man who has seen the ceiling of a chapel painted in a way that exposes his skull to the sky cannot go back to praying in rooms with flat plaster. You may call it obsession. I will not object. It felt like sobriety. In the days that followed, the world above ground developed a gleam that I had not previously noticed, as if a film had been wiped from the glass of the city. The pilgrim's laughter in street. Peter's Square acquired undertones. The obelisk's shadow seemed more decisive when it chose where to fall. The colonnades choreographed pigeons with an authority that had nothing to do with wind. A crosswalk on the Borgo Pio halted traffic with such moral certainty that I almost knelt at its curb. This is what happens when you descend into a place beneath a place. You return infected with geometry. Alignments that were previously the accidents of architecture announce themselves as decisions. Noon becomes a blade. Midnight becomes a hinge. On my third descent, I brought a second candle and a stub of graphite. I had told myself I would sketch the quill binding nothing more. Men of my profession never admit we intend theft. We redraw. We model for the catalog. The candle sputtered as I turned the key, then steadied, having made its little scene. The corridor accepted me with the reluctance of a home that knows you have been away but not how to ask where. The strap gleamed and declined to speak. The sentence at the table's lip had chosen, as was its habit, a new sense for the verb. I let it. The ledger opened itself as if I had earned the gesture. The new folio I found described a choir whose eyes were veiled, and I could hear, with the embarrassing clarity of a boy pressed to the keyhole of a rehearsal room, a measure kept with no sound. Do you know what disciplined silence sounds like? It sounds like hands moving in agreement. I do not know how long I stayed there. I know how long the basilica thought I stayed, which is a different number. When I finally returned the candle to the trestle and turned to leave, condensation bloomed again on the iron door's skin, as if a beast had just spoken very near to it. The words arranged themselves from the inside out, the way breath on cold glass obeys an old habit. Keep the 13th hour. I had seen the phrase in margin notes, scrawled in a quick hand by men who, by all other evidence, despised poetry. The command was not flamboyant. It was administrative. A deadline, a watchword, a reminder pinned above a desk. Nothing thrills a bureaucrat like a necessary impossibility. Keep an hour that does not fit on the clock. Keep it in trust. Use it when memory misbehaves. I touched the letters, and the damp took my fingerprint without complaint. The words unbent into the iron and were gone. Above ground, the bell would tell the city that everything was normal. It would do its best. It would deliver 12 sincere declarations, and then, moved by some sympathy it had with what lay below, it would add the smallest 13th, a grace note or a lie, depending on your theology. When I finally slept, I dreamed not of demons, horns, smoke, charred treaties, but of paperwork in a hand I almost recognized. Phrases such as, for safe keeping, to reconcile, in consideration of, marched in neat columns, and in the margins, a human face my face took shape from the tilt of adjectives. I woke with my hands under the pillow, as if I had hidden them from myself. I tell you this because you will expect horns, you will expect spectacle, you will expect betrayal to take the shape of a beast. In my experience, betrayal prefers to be a form. It prefers to be initialed, filed, fetched when necessary, and otherwise left to sleep in a tray under someone's carefully measured calendar. If there is a demon in the crypt, and I have not yet told you what they call the leather, what the margin suggests about its provenance, that demon is not theatrical. It is administrative. It is the part of us that wishes to dine without the discomfort of remembering the animal. It is the instrument that binds the future by unlacing the past. It is, in short, the easiest habit you can imagine, practiced very well. I will tell you what I saw. I have tried to tell you honestly the shape of my fear and the posture of my disobedience. I will continue to tell you, because once the page learns your face, it does not quickly forget it, and once a door opens by accident, it becomes for you, and maybe only for you, the kind of accident that repeats. I will tell you about the ledger's second column, how it tallies not money but memory. I will tell you about the choir who wears veils not to hide from light but to tune it. I will tell you about the strap that is not leather, and why men who would never raise a sword willingly raise their pen in its presence. But not yet. We are still at the threshold, you and I. Listening to a violin hinge, remember how to weep. For now, keep this. In the crypt below street, Peter's silence wasn't sacred, it was enforced. And when you have felt enforced silence in your bones once, you can hear its echo in places that have no crypts at all, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in the way a headline corrects itself into something blander by the third edition. If the Basilica has taught me anything worth the risk of saying aloud, it is that there is always an extra ring on the bell if you listen with the part of your ear that doesn't care to be thanked. So, if you must sleep, and I know you must let this be the thought that walks you to the shore of it. Perhaps the day is longer than they told you. Perhaps there is a 13th hour, a seam sewn into the fabric that only opens when a certain kind of attention is paid. I did not discover it. I tripped it, the way a man bumps a locked drawer and learns that its wood remembers a particular touch. It has been waiting for better men than me. It does not ask for courage. It asks only that you admit, when the page looks back at you, that you, too, are being written. And if you wake in the middle of the night with the taste of old coins at the back of your tongue, and the sense no more than that a sentence is changing tenses while you are not looking, do not be alarmed. Breathe, count if you must. Touch the wall beside your bed and feel whether it remembers you. The door is not in your house. It is in the habit by which we bless what is recorded and excuse what is revised. The key may not be on your ring. It may be in the way your questions arrange themselves when no one is grading you. If there is a garden, it has walls. If there are walls, there is a gate. And if there is a gate, then on some hot night in a city of stone and rumor, the hinge will sing like a wet violin, and a man who wanted only to file his papers and go home will stand very still, as the air that meets him smells of tallow and old coins, and something else he will spend the rest of his life learning the name of. I was ordained at 27 and unmade by 33. Between those two numbers there is room for an hour no clock admits. I am telling you where I found it. I am telling you because I have learned that telling is the only way to keep it, and because the door, once opened, refuses to be mine alone. I did not become an archivist because I loved truth. I became one because I loved order. Truth is a sea. Order is a shelf. Give me a ruler, linen gloves, a pot of paste with a brush thin as a nerve, and I will make calamity look like it belongs. If a page's corner snaps off in your fingers, leave it with me. I will suture its absence into the narrative so neatly that even regret will feel alphabetized. This is how cowards survive, by arranging the furniture of the room so the beast has nowhere to sit. In the mornings, the basilica behaved like a great, well-fed animal, stretching the stones in its ribs as the sun rehearsed its angles across the floor. Pilgrims breathed their small astonishments. Tour guides performed mercies of compression. Guards made a liturgy of boredom. Downstairs, the scriptorium was a weather of its own. Light came to it late, stumbled, apologized, and left. The air had a storeroom, taste linen, lime wash, and that medicinal sweetness of bindings, oiled by the careful to keep them supple against time's chapped hand. I was good at my work, good the way a locksmith is good. I knew that every lock is a compliment to the person who will someday open it. Libri catenati, the chained books hung from long iron tethers as though they were a choir practicing restraint. We did not chain them to punish curiosity. We chained them to granted audience with an adult. That is what we told ourselves, and some days I believed it. My station faced a wall covered in oak drawers, each labeled in a practiced hand, mappe for maps, sigilla for seals, miscellanea for the overflow that proves a system is honest. When the day began, I opened the drawers like a priest, unveiling reliquaries, and maps exhaled their latitude into the room. Maps teach you that power is a geometry of patience. Someone must sit long enough to turn rivers into sentences. Someone must decide which errors will be permitted to persist for the sake of a beautiful coastline. It was among the maps that the unease began to put on weight. An atlas from the late 16th century offered Rome the courtesy of a tiny moon, pinned above the city, as if to explain its nocturnal habits. On a fold-out plate, the basilica's plan had been overlaid with a sky, a web of constellations whose lines did not match the usual merchant's zodiac. Virgo was no maiden. She was a key. Scorpius bent not like a tail, but like a clasp. Aquila hung above the crossing like a hinge. In the margin, a notation in a hand that had disciplined many students: keep the 13th hour. I asked the senior archivist, Monsignor L., if he recognized the hand. He declined the recognition with the gentleness of a man returning a trinket to a child without humiliating him. Annotation is an infection, he said, looking over my shoulder without reading. Once you allow it, the body of a text learns to host it everywhere. We vaccinate by not caring. Then he patted the drawer and added, almost as an afterthought, close that. It attracts the wrong kind of light. There are shelves that welcome you and shelves that apprentice your fear. The section labeled Apocrypha, PVBLCO, non-ostendenda, was an example of the latter. The iron grill made a promise out of the dust. Come back with permission, or invent some. Inside, manuscripts wore their prohibitions like cologne. A gospel attributed to a woman's voice lay under glass, wearing a dust jacket of ashes. On its catalog card, someone had rewritten suppressed to retired in ink so confident it made the truth look unprofessional. A chain marked with a lion crest hung from a hook, its ring sewn shut with wire. The seal was unfamiliar. A lion, mouth-stitched, tongue implied but not granted. Not catalogued, Monsignor L. had said the first time I saw it. Not for you. There were days many when I performed my duties, as if nothing under the basilica had teeth. I stamped receiving slips for volumes whose spines whispered grudges in Gothic. I recorded donors' names, and sometimes I recorded their erasures. We have a form for that. Formularium 27B. Administrative realignment. If a benefactor becomes inconvenient to history, we do not burn the plaque. We retitle it. The plaque does the same work with less biography attached. You could almost call it charity. Almost. I was not, as I have said, brave. But cowardice is a poor immune system for questions. They get in anyway. They take their small chair at the back of your skull, and they wait. The question that set up house in me was simple. Why did the basilica's clocks and bells sometimes disagree about the debt they owed the day? A clock is a bureaucracy. A bell is an animal. When the bell struck 12, and then hesitantly, illicitly once more, the clock did not correct it. The clock preferred its policy to events. The bell had seen the crypt. That is what I began to think. That the bell knew something about the hours that the clock refused to include. I started keeping a ledger of discrepancies between noon and a slice of noon that belonged to neither. Between midnight and the ragged hem that followed it. It made no sense at first. My little table of notes looked like the schedule of an absent-minded saint. but patterns are loyal to the patient. Thursdays lied less. The fifth day of the month offered a flourish. On certain vigils, the bell's throat trembled with a 13 that swore it had not happened when you asked other ears. I share this to explain why, when the ledger bound in quills came into my hands again, I was ready to be convinced by it. The first time I had found it by accident, a door's whim teaching me obedience to drafts. The second time, I found it by method. I looked where one looks for things that have chosen not to be found. That is, I reshelved everything correctly. The ledger was not on the shelf because the shelf, when I had finished making it impeccable, revealed an inch of shadow that did not belong to it. I moved my hand through that inch, as a fisherman tests invisible water for the memory of fish. Something brushed me. Paper did not brush. Feathers did. It opened to an entry dated in a calendar that refused to name its century. The script was rigid but compassionate, the way an undertaker folds a child's suit. The left column recorded a reconciliation of feasts with celestial observations, what the public tale calls the Gregorian reform. It is a noble tale. Men of intellect, humbled by the sky, adjust our keeping of days so harvests and saints and schools cease drifting from their rightful seasons. The ledger's right column did not argue with this tale. It amortized it. For each correction, a note of what that shift bought, an anniversary detached from the event that gave it teeth, a jubilee made to coincide with a crown, a fast day's hunger repurposed as the hunger for a campaign. A phrase recurred in the margins. Anni misericordiae, mercy years. No one had taught me this term. It read as if spoken softly between the kind of men who never raise their voices because they have raised their children. Mercy years were not for the poor. They were for the church. They were the hours and days shaved from the calendar and stored like coins in a drawer whose key was kept on a ring that never left a certain pocket. When you possess spare time, time that the public cannot name, you can spend it without confession. You can cue events in it that leave no record, because the hour that hosted them does not belong to the day. The bell tells the truth once. The clock tells the story forever after. The ledger named events as if describing weather. A saint's cult relocated to the north to cool the city. A visor lowered over a philosopher's son to keep the apprentices from staring. A widow's copyright reassigned to the church to prevent squandering. Each line felt sane if you lacked a taste for consequence. The demon in the ledger was not perched on the top of a page. It ran along the bottom like a footnote that could not be dislodged. Interest paid in silence. Principal collected in fear. You must understand what fear meant in this accounting. It was not terror in the manner of flames and hooks. It was the fear of being a person without lineage, an event without an anniversary, a thought without a place to return to. If you remove the date from a memory, you begin to domesticate it. If you remove the street from an address, you can store the whole neighborhood in a drawer. I had spent my adult life giving things nice drawers. In those weeks, I visited shelves I had never had reason to love. Diplomata, duplicata, the duplicates. Paired papal bulls from near adjacent pontificates, almost identical in language except where one would urge a crusade and the other would bless a harvest, each capable of being bound forward or backward according to the famine in a given year. The red ribbon determined which copy would wear posterity. The Church speaks with one voice. The Catechism teaches. The ledger's right column clarified the technique. The voice was an arrangement. The throat was a composite. Many voices stitched into the convenience of one. The composite could be leaned this way or that without ceasing to be itself. There were other rooms. The Custodia Obelici, the obelisk's custody, contained brass instruments used to calibrate noon, as if noon were a virtue in need of confession. A sliver of polished stone, barely larger than a butter knife, had been scribed with degrees so fine the eye became superstitious, trying to count them. In a diary I was not meant to read, a custodian wrote, "When noon is obedient, midnight will misplace itself." I copied the line into my pocketbook and then crossed it out as if the act could discourage its accuracy. The scriptorium kept a small cabinet of inks whose labels were an anthology of caution, atramentum vivum, living ink, to be used only on pages that would not be shown to sunlight. Atramentum silens, silent ink. Its recipe an argument between alchemists and accountants. Atramentum specular mirror ink. The vial bore a smear the color of an eclipse's edge. When I tilted it, the liquid did not slosh. It repositioned itself the way a lizard reforms after you disturb the leaves it mimics. There was a recipe bound into a thin manual whose paper crackled like starched clothes. Boil the gall, decant by the weight of a prayer. Let the surface remember your face. Tools have tones. The tone of this manual was that of a janitor explaining a dangerous machine to a new hire. I experimented once, in a sanctioned way, with a permissible variant. A scrap of parchment, a nib, a line of script copied from a safe psalm. When the ink dried, the words were unexceptional until I leaned near, and the O in Domine winked with my eye. The insinuation of being looked at by a sentence was almost comforting. It gave the illusion of companionship. This is how enforcement works when it has money for good clothes. It makes you feel accompanied by your compliance. One evening, finding myself alone in the cabinet room, alone in the way we are when our companions agree not to count, weighed the mirror ink vial in my hand while staring at a small ledger laid out, as if for surgery. The leather strap lay to one side, dressed and uncomplaining. A note pinned by a brass tack described it as Chirotheca Daemonis Demonhide glove, though there was no glove, only a strap. The phrase might have been euphemism or catechetical insult. I have touched the strap. It was not a metaphor to my skin. A confession is a chain. Each link depends on the last and hopes to meet the next without scandal. So allow me to record this. I signed receipts for ashes that had once been a book written in a woman's voice. I boxed a clock whose 13 had become too articulate for visitor comfort. I rehoused a set of maps annotated with constellations into a drawer labeled decorative. I initialed a card that redirected an inventor's sketchbooks to a shelf called devotion. Until I wrote those initials, I could claim not to know the direction of my obedience. Afterward, I knew. The ledger in my hands, the one bound with quills, rested open to a page where my initials were already present, written by a future they had arranged for me. I have told you, cowardice is my craft, but even cowards have bones. Mine began to ache when I discovered the index at the back of the quill-bound ledger. It was not an index of subjects. It was an index of absences, saints unnamed, popes OCCLVDIT, feasts relocated, Instrumenta translata in miracev LVM. Instruments translated into miracles. A telescope baptized as a reliquary because it had seen too much. A fulcrum marketed as a saint's finger bone because it had lifted the wrong empire. The index was an anthology of what happens when the useful can no longer be recognized without confessing to its utility. I began to suspect that the Pact, whatever we mean by that word, was not a horned congress in some obscene chapel, but a habit of administration. The signatories were not villains from woodcuts. They were men like me, practiced at naming things until the names became furniture. Furniture can be blessed. Furniture can be moved at night. There is in the crypt an aisle where the floor bows, very slightly, as if the weight of footfalls had taught the stone to breathe out when visited. There, in a poor frame, hung a diagram that would have been laughable if it had been less mild. A circle, a smaller circle, 12 small slashes, and a 13th drawn slightly outside the clock like a polite guest reluctant to join the family photograph. Ora tertia decima, the 13th hour. Below, in patient, careful letters, keep it, as if it were a pet, as if it needed feeding, as if neglected, it might run off and remember everything it had seen. Monsignor L. found me standing before it like a parishioner who has mistaken a catechism for a love letter. "You are reading too closely," he said, which is a very Rome way of instructing a man to keep his job. "We preserve by curation," he added, the words worn smooth by having been used to soothe better men than me. "And by omission." "Omission," I repeated, as if learning the pronunciation of a saint. He smiled his gentle wolf smile. "It is the simplest form of mercy. We omit details that do not edify." He did not look at the circle with the 13th scratch. "The world is improved when its children are not handed every knife." There's and I nodded, and Coward wrote in my pocketbook, "Mercy is what we call a well-fed omission." Then I crossed that out too, because I had not yet learned to believe the sentences that made me unpopular with my own employer. There were nights when the basilica's breath sank to the crypt and lifted in sympathy the dust motes like 1,000 disciplined gnats. I would stand, ledger open, and feel watched not by eyes but by arrangements. Shelves that preferred certain angles of light, drawers that slid quietly closed on time that had been reassigned elsewhere. In that mood, it was not a large step to imagine how a calendar could be used as a leash. The phantom time hypothesis, the notion that centuries had been invented to launder power. What a gaudy claim, good for pamphlets and the dinner tables of men who enjoy scandal as seasoning. We did not need phantom centuries. We had mercy years. We had hours that could be moved like placeholders, commas shifted in the sentence of a day until meaning obeyed the meaning we wanted. Do you know how you domesticate a miracle? You repeat it. At the 10th repetition, it becomes a law. After a century, it is a tradition. At 5 centuries, it is an assumption against which no one would think to bring evidence. The ledger called this by its older name, management. When I say we, I am generous with myself. I was a clerk, barely upgraded from a boy who loved neat edges. But archives are ecosystems. Even the smallest herb participates in the forest's temperament. My quills and my glue and my careful, cowardly fingers tended a climate in which the Pact call it that, for lack of a more accurate offense, did not need to be signed in smoke and blood. It could be initialed in pencil and then inked by a committee, and the ink would remember your face if you tried to withdraw your consent. One early morning night's tale still caught in the grating of the stairwell, dawn fidgeting in the apse like a late student. I returned to the quill-bound book and found a sheet stitched in like contraband skin. It described witnesses. Contracts crave witnesses. Even lies believe in liturgy. The names were titles, not persons. The Veiled Eyes Choir, keepers of silence, pitched in a key that persuades stone to carry it. The scriptorium of reflections, scribes trained to write by erasure, so that truth appears where text refuses to. The custodian of the obelisk, who calibrates noon until midnight, misplaces itself. Next to each title, a notation of responsibilities and allowances, as if the cosmos were a payroll. On the facing page, 2 signatures. The first, banal, arrogant in its banality. Vicarious. No name, only the office, because offices are built to outlive names. The second signature was not letters. It was a contour you could only resolve if you leaned over it until your breath made the ink shiver. In the mirror ink, it revealed itself as the outline of a question mark sewn shut. I did not faint. Fainting would have been romantic, and I have never been accused of that. I set my palms on the table and felt how the oak remembered storms. I breathed like a man, learning to be alone with a sentence that will not confess to its subject. Then I did what any coward does when the room begins to smell like what he has chosen not to know. I inventoried spine height, margins, the lay of the decal, the stitching, the evidence that craft is still a god worth a little reverence. Only when my hands had calmed themselves by counting did I see that the leather strap, the Demonhide, was threaded through a slit in the folio, as if to serve as a bookmark. I pinched its tip between finger and thumb. The cold rose again, a column up my bones, and I tasted pennies as if heaven paid in small change. A sentence formed not in the air, not in my ear, but in the part of the skull where prayers pretend to be thoughts. To keep the hour, remove the day. I swallowed and discovered my mouth dry as plaster. I put the strap down. I closed the book. I blew out the candle and stood in the dark, not because I wanted darkness, but because I needed the room to forget my face. The bell above me issued 12 sincere notes, dutiful and adequate. I counted them as a child counts steps to prove a wish. Then, from a distance that suggested a throat embarrassed at its own honesty, a small 13th. There are times a man knows he has crossed, from describing his life into being described by it. That morning climbing, I watched my shadow on the stair perform obedience, and I recognized in its posture a being who had never been brave and never will be, but who might, in a moment requiring less courage than consistency, whisper an inventory in public and suffer the consequences. It is fashionable to despise inventories. They are unsexy and slow. But the truth is an inventory. What was taken, what was left, what was renamed so the loss would not bruise the air. Consider this an inventory of my fear, of our methods, of a ledger that makes a simple claim in Baroque clothing, that memory is property and time a budget, and the church, my church, has balanced its books by moving anniversaries until they match the face of the men who must stand beneath them. I am not yet ready to tell you the whole of the Pact. That is the work of a climax, and climaxes are tyrants. They rush what should be revealed with the patience of a librarian. Chapter by chapter, We will lift the harmless-looking implements and admit the teeth they hide. We will follow the map whose door is painted in stars and hear a choir tune stone with a silence finer than any pitchfork. We will watch a saint lose a name and a pope acquire a throat he did not start with. And, if I can keep the 13th hour as it asks to be kept, we will open the book again to the page where the signatures learn to move. For now, keep this. I was not brave, I was obedient. And obedience, practiced long enough, acquires a piety that can bless almost anything, even omission, especially omission. If you find yourself, in some future room, deciding which story to keep and which to furl like a flag that embarrasses a parade, listen for the 13th bell. If it answers, ask what feast the new date moved away from. Ask whose ash warmed the page. Ask why the ink knows your face. And if you hear nothing, if the bell behaves itself and the clock smiles, its polite lies do not relax. Silence may be sacred where you are, or it may only be well enforced. I had always believed that books merely received attention. The feathered ledger taught me that some books return it with interest. After the first encounters, I began to keep a ridiculous kind of diary, not of contents, but of how the ledger behaved. On certain evenings it opened reluctant and papery, as if sloughed from a moult. On others it welcomed me with a flex along the spine, a small vertebral acknowledgement I could feel through the linen of my gloves. I wrote down the hour, the candle height, the temperature stuck in my throat, the precise tone of the bell preceding my descent. I wrote down the color of the dust. I was trying to learn whether that book possessed weather. The quills were not decoration. Their lacquered shafts were arrayed to breathe. When I leaned near, they gathered the air and released it with a quiet that sounded like the domesticated wing beats of an indoor bird. I knew the intent. The binding adjusted humidity so the pages kept their shape. But intention is not the same as effect. The effect was companionship. Any solitary man is at risk of mishearing maintenance as affection. The ledger's script was the unshowy hand of a very confident clerk, upright, convinced of the portability of facts, with letters slender as iron filings arranged by a magnet you could not see. The left column recorded transactions of memory, the right column their cost. Between them ran a gutter that might as well have been a river crossing. In the margins, small emendations, some in red so dark it prefaced brown, some in the graphite of men who wanted their doubts erasable. Names, where there were names, had softened with years like stones in a stream. Titles kept their edges longer. In the folio I turned to after many false starts, there was a rubric, not in Latin, but in an administrative romance so crisp you could smell the glue. Ritus specularis, the mirror ink right for custodian's use. I had expected the vulgarity of candles and oaths. Instead, I found a recipe, as unemotional as a good autopsy. 1. Gather the galls of a tree that has learned to defend itself. 2. Decant iron from a dust that once made nails honest. 3. Add water drawn at noon from a font that does not believe in visitors. 4. Stir anti-sunwise with a reed whose cut remembers the slope of a breath. 5. Strain through linen that has already learned a face. 6. Allow to settle until the surface reflects without asking to be a mirror. 7. Test upon a page that will never meet daylight. Underneath, in smaller letters, a caution I would later recognize as the Basilica's favorite voice. If the ink remembers you too well, the right must be delayed. There is no sin in waiting. There is only inventory. The Basilica wanted technicians, not mystics. It wanted men who could talk about consequences with the clean fingers of cause. I told myself I could be such a man. If you complete the steps, there is no need to concede the ceremony. The mind loves a list, because a list appears to keep company with control. I assembled what the rite required without confessing to myself that I was assembling it. A glass beaker disguised as a chalice, a pestle that had crushed many things that did not deserve to be crushed, oak galls with their bruised apple scent, the iron powder that chalked my sleeves and made me smell like a rail yard, linen from a sacramental drawer that had already been kissed by men whose sins impressed themselves faintly in the weave, a reed cut slant, a reed that remembered breath, a reed I would later dream of, set across a mouth as if to measure silence like lung capacity. The strap lay to one side, unassuming, the color of a bruise deciding whether to heal. Its warmth, even far from flame, humbled me. Leather warms when you handle it. This warmed as if it were handling me. A marginal hand had labeled it Chirotheca daemonis, Demonhide glove, though nothing in its shape welcomed fingers. Another hand, fussier, had added beneath in Latin the kind of correction that pretends to be a courtesy. Not demon, but fear-tanned. The correction was not meant to comfort. It was meant to be exact. I ground the gall to slurry while the bell above me rehearsed noon. The mortar lifted a smell like old tea and pennies. I stirred anti-sunwise, a direction I had always considered poetic, until the room taught me it is a kind of hygiene. Move against the sky, and the sky may fail to notice you. When I poured the iron water, it darkened with the immediate complicity of a rumor. When I strained through the linen, only there did I feel the room turn to face me. Linen keeps secrets only if its memory remains shallow. The weave had learned too much. It recognized my hands as if we had collaborated before. This is the problem with sacrament. Fabric grows biographical. The first test line I made on a sacrificial scrap was unremarkable, black, legible, a dutiful servant. The second caught a glint of my face and returned it with the modesty of a puddle. The third brought me up short. The loop of the letter E rounded into a socket, and, very briefly, my pupil occupied that socket and looked back, properly framed by the grammar of the text. It would be hysterical to call it a vision. It would be dishonest to call it trivial. I put the scrap aside, the way a priest, encountering a relic in a drawer he was simply trying to tidy, puts it aside to finish the tidy. When the room has no eyes, manners help. The right second page concerned reading mirror ink, and here the vocabulary enjoyed itself. Words that had been dutiful in the recipe allowed themselves a little philosophy. Do not lean so close that the text must correct your face. Do not stand so far that you mistake your outline for consensus. Permit the page to know you as a colleague. Permit the page to disapprove. A clerk had added in pencil, "Disapproval is proof the ink has not been bribed." I thought, foolishly, that bribes are a human monopoly, but the right concerned attention as a currency. You pay the page with your looking. The page pays back with its version of you. If the account balances, reading can proceed without penalty. If it does not, the penalties accrue in memory. This was the tone: fiscal, institutional, elegant with the indifference of men who have balanced books for centuries. Beneath the recipe was the portion that first made me suspect Pact rather than merely practice. Witnesses and allowances. It read like payroll. The Veiled Eyes Choir. To tune silence across stone so it carries without echo. Allowed access to mercy years for the length of 3 measures, responsible for the dispersal of surplus certainty through chant. The scriptorium of reflections, to write by erasure, to ink the negative so truth appears where letters refuse to stand. Allowed to redate 1 incident per generation by unanimous hum, responsible for preventing new miracles from forming habits prematurely. The custodian of the obelisk, to calibrate noon until midnight misplaces itself, allowed to spend up to 2 hours from mercy stock on jubilees, responsible for ensuring shadows speak the correct arithmetic. Each line contained a dangerous kindness, the suggestion that responsibility, not appetite, governed them all. Administrative virtue can carry any sin if the ledger's right column keeps looking tidy. There were signatures. Vicarious was one, no person, only the impersonality of office. The second was a contour, no ink at all, until the ink noticed me. In the mirror sheen, the line resolved into the outline of a question mark sewn shut. I made a note in my pocketbook that I later tore out and burned. If you can suture a question, you can harvest silence like wool. I tell you this slowly, because speed dishonors procedure. The temptation, when one is horrified, is to run to climax, but archives dislike sprinting. They believe in form. The right asked for one more element I had neglected. A circle of salt that does not melt. The stores contained a brown jar with a label worn almost to myth. I had read about such salt, argued its chemistry with men who like the taste of tricks. The crystals poured like good sand. They did not dissolve when I touched them with ink. The circle I drew around the trestle table was wide enough to admit cowardice. I placed the ledger at the circle's center and set the strap that was not leather across its open folio like a small bridge. The candle flame reached up with a child's certainty. I breathed the way I had trained myself to breathe when lifting reliquaries. In through the nose, out through whatever exits remain. The rite required no oath, only a posture hands apart, palms toward the page. The kind of openness that is suspicious in men and probably always has been. The first sensation was banal. Air cooling across the backs of my hands as if a door had opened elsewhere, and my small weather felt a draft from a larger climate. The second was less easy to house. A pressure along the ridge that runs from the base of the skull to the little knot between the shoulders, the place where sacks are slung when you consent to carry. The page brightened without brightening. The black drank more of the candle's authority, and the whites took on the particulate density of a cloud, deciding whether to be a lake. I read aloud. It is humiliating to confess, but my voice adopted the cadence of a bureaucrat, a man who enumerates to reassure himself that the world will remain divisible. The text did not alter itself into poetry. It presented instructions, and the instructions agreed to be my master. It explained how a mercy year is detached asterisk from the public year, not the eternal asterisk, and stored under the basilica where shadows keep count. It explained the use of that time, to rehouse anniversaries, to reconcile calendars with the needs of crowns, to ensure that certain experiments occur in private so their success can be made to look like grace when finally revealed. It explained disbursements, how much certainty a choir may carry without becoming an idol, How much doubt scholars can safely warehouse before the room begins to smell like knives. Then the ledger asked me to pause. Not in words, but in a manner pages possess when they choose. The ink steadied its tremor, the gait of the lines altered. My reflection, which had lived shyly in the bowls of letters, came forward with the nerve of a clerk. In the sentence, I could see my eyes decide to be tired. They were forgiven their tiredness by a grammar that preferred men without sleep. A small line, lower margin, right corner the place where inattentive readers are least likely to look, tilted itself toward me. It was not text. It was an inventory of signatures, and opposite them a narrow strip of vellum sewed into the gutter, perfused with a low warmth like a living pocket. I could not pretend surprise. The strap had waited. I lifted it with forefinger and thumb, and felt, for the second time, the cold rise that conveys the taste of copper into the mouth. The strap's surface was stippled like the underside of a fish you have not yet admitted is dead. There were pores, there were lines. One does not need the courage to announce the obvious aloud. One merely needs to refrain from fainting when the obvious insists on honesty. If not animal, then fear-tanned. If not hide, then dread given durability. The right named the strap an enforcer. It did not hide behind theology. When the hand wavers, the line read, bind the ledger with dread, and the ink will resume remembering properly. The sentence pretended to be about paper. The sentence, like many sentences dressed in small clothes, was about us. I tried the binding, as a man tries on the jacket of a uniform he suspects will fit too well. The strap went around the ledger with the complacency of a tool designed perfectly for its labor. When the quills lay down and the spine hugged itself, a sound like a very small exhale left the page a gratefulness that made me ashamed. Shame is not always a sign of sin. Sometimes it is the conscience remembering a world where binding a book with fear would be considered barbaric. I unbound it quickly and turned the page in the hope that motion would keep my thoughts from stiffening. The new folio was not a recipe but an account. Mercy year dispersed. Feast of a widow relocated to obscure a coronation. Instruments translated into miracles to pacify apprentices. The 13th hour allocated to a conclave without minutes. The right column tallied the price. Silence accrued, curiosity amortized, memory collateralized against a future sermon. In the margin, a human protest. Too much. The protest had been struck through by a different hand, then annotated. Sufficient. I had been taught restraint as a virtue. In a crypt, restraint becomes complicity. The difference is not moral, it is architectural. Rooms pressure you into certain geometries of behavior. The circle of salt asked if I wanted to leave indentations on it with my shoes. I stepped back and then forward again as if rehearsing an exit so that later, when the exit became necessary, it would feel practiced rather than panicked. The ledger's lower edge bore a cluster of lesser notes that refined obligation to the point of intimacy. If a saint's miracle breeds pride, cool the relics. If a scholar's proof breeds hunger overmuch, translate his instrument into a sacrament and award it a glass case. If a city begins to keep its own calendar, lend it a jubilee. This was not doctrine, it was irrigation. The basilica watered the people and withheld water where weeds enjoyed themselves. If you are sufficiently gentle, even pruning can call itself mercy. There was one instruction that struck me as almost tender. Do not break the clock, persuade the bell. Under it, a paragraph in smaller print explained that bells, unlike clocks, were willing to remember the 13th hour if you invited them carefully. Allow them a little honesty, the line coaxed, and they will correct themselves before the city wakes. Clocks prefer law, bells prefer truth. They are both useful. I wanted idiotically to apologize to the bell. In the days that followed, the right's logic infiltrated my habits like a dye in clear water. When a visiting scholar, beaming with the entitled wonder of a man who has earned his astonishment, asked to see a manuscript attributed to Mary in a voice no catalogue had taught him to expect, my mouth produced a sentence I had not authorized. That particular relic is retired. When a junior archivist misfiled a test tube in atramentum silens instead of atramentum vivum, I corrected him with a tone borrowed from the marginalia. Patient, hygienic, murderous only to anomalies. I was becoming the thing the ledger predicted. I do not mean a villain, I mean an instrument. I returned to the mirror ink, not to worship it, but to test the boundary at which it would refuse to remember me. There is such a boundary. If you meet the page with too much hunger, the letters dull. If you come falsely humble, they smirk. Between pride and abasement lies the very narrow path of legibility. The right insists that reading is a partnership. Partnerships fail for reasons no clause can anticipate. On one evening I approached with a tiredness that had grown teeth. The ink returned a man with less face than appetite, and the letters would not hold still. I left without turning a page. That is the mercy of rituals. They allow retreat to count as a learned step rather than a loss. Then came the night the chapel above hosted a vigil, and the basilica's breath crowded down the stair like faithful late to a seat. The crypt responded with a courtesy of its own. It brightened slightly, as if the stones wished to be hospitable. I admit I enjoyed the companionship. The ledger opened as a seasoned officer opens a door for a recruit he has decided to break gently. The folio waiting described witnessing. Contracts require witnesses. Even lies prefer an audience that can be invoked when they age into truth. Witness I, the Veiled Eyes Choir. I had read them as a payroll curiosity. The right fleshed them into function. Silence, it wrote, being not the absence of sound but the tuning of breath, must be set to a pitch that pleases stone. The choir did not sing notes. They aligned air until walls consented to carry. I could hear the technique implied in the words, a soft inhalation, a held not quite tone, the raising of a palate until a corridor decides to become a throat. When that happens, ink listens. Memory listens. The page acquires acoustics, and the reader hears himself properly for the first time. It is dangerous to be heard properly. Witness 2, the scriptorium of reflections. Their task was to write by refusal, to produce documents whose negative space committed truths the letters declined to host. They perfected the art of what the public treats as omission. They carved the path by which a sentence can mean two honorable things, one for daylight and one for the mercy stocks 4 stairs below. The right regarded them with the respect reserved for men who can make a white wall eloquent. Witness 3, the custodian of the obelisk. I confess a personal attachment. I had spent afternoons watching tourists eat gelato in the obelisk's shadow. The document made that shadow a metronome. Noon was not a time, it was a verdict. If you calibrate the verdict carefully, midnight forgets some of its dignity. When noon is obedient, The custodian's diary had mused, "Midnight will misplace itself." The rite adopted the line without attribution, which is the ecclesiastical version of applause. There was a fourth witness without title, the strap. No romance, no mystique. The strap enforced. If the ledger hesitated, if the page began to like its reader too much, if the ink forgot its task and relished the face, fear would be applied minimally and with craft. The strap did not terrorize. It tightened the book's belief in its own purpose. It is a dreadful thing to watch a tool remember its job. I wrote these notes in a pocketbook I kept in my inside jacket, the one that sweat found only when I lied. That evening, as I finished committing the witnesses to a handwriting I had spent a boyhood perfecting, a small motion tugged my eye. Not the strap, not the candle. In the glass of a reliquary on the shelf beyond the trestle, a breath blurred the reflected flame. I turned, half expecting a man, half expecting the end of an era. Nothing stood there but an elbow of darkness, feeling for a new angle. Yet the breath bloom remained for one beat too, and on the glass it spelled imprecisely, like a toddler naming a thing he loves. Keep the 13th hour. It is a weary sentence at this point in my tale, I know. But habits gather force by repetition, and I began to suspect that the crypt preferred insistence to insight. I closed the ledger. The strap cooled under my fingers. The salt circle kept its shape, as if the floor intended to keep that chalk forever. Above, the basilica offered its late benedictions, a soft sibilance of tourists forgiving themselves for being in a holy place. The bell counted 12, and then, because truth is not rude, only honest, one more, very gently, as if apologizing to me for its existence. I left the rites apparatus in order. I returned the linen to its drawer. I labeled the beaker as if it were just a beaker. I wiped a dot of mirror ink from the trestle and watched it resist being wiped, the way certain consciences prefer to be sanded rather than cleaned. My hands smelled of iron and orchard. The strap had no smell, which is how perfumers tell you you are already wearing the fragrance. On the stair, climbing, I worked to repopulate the world with its secular names. A door was a door. Not every hinge is a violin. Not every breath belongs to a corridor. It is a discipline to keep nouns honest. The city cooperated by being itself, scooters performing penance on cobbles, a couple arguing with the finesse of tightrope walkers, a priest buying cigarettes with a conspirator's shoulder. The obelisk measured noon for men who had no appointment with it. I stood in its shadow and examined my hands in a light that refused to remember me. The mirror ink had left a residue near the cuticles. No stain. Exactly. More a suggestion of lettering that would develop in a dark room if I allowed my life to become one. In my room, the diary I kept for myself, the coward's ledger, private and disobedient, received a line I allowed to stand. We do not make pacts with monsters. We institutionalize our appetites and call that prudence. The Demonhide belongs on our books because fear is the only animal we can tan indefinitely. I did not cross it out. I went to the window and watched birds adopt the geometry of the square. They made obedience lovely. I slept poorly and woke with the taste of small coins. The day performed itself. The drawers accepted their labels. The junior archivist miscounted seals and apologized to the correct god. I met Monsignor L. in the corridor, and we nodded as men nod when they have agreed not to address the thing that would reroute their weeks. He tapped a stack of receiving slips and said, "We preserve by curation," which is the equivalent in our profession, of good weather. Ezer dunned that night when I returned to the crypt, because appetite dressed as duty is still appetite. The right had acquired a postscript in a shaky but official hand. If the page has learned your face too well, assign another face. Rotations preserve institutions. It is one of the more chilling sentences I have ever read, not because it threatens harm, but because it announces a depravity only bureaucracies master, that faces are interchangeable, and attention is a resource to be budgeted like wax. I should have obeyed it. I should have installed a colleague between myself and the book to absorb the mirror's interest. I should have let him carry the residue, so the institution could proceed without losing its balance to one man's conscience. Instead, I did what cowards do when they are tired of their cowardice. I pretended to be brave in a very specific, very controlled way. I broke the salt circle, just to see if the world would end. It did not. A gust found the room at once, quick as a rumor. The candle swayed. The strap shivered like a muscle returning to itself after restraint. My mouth announced my name in Latin without my consent. Nothing collapsed. The ledger merely adjusted, the way a physician turns a patient to hear a different valve. I had expected melodrama. The basilica hates melodrama. It prefers consequences. The consequence of my small disobedience was neither lightning nor a reprimand. It was the smallest recalibration of the ink. When I bent to read, my reflection arrived with an extra weariness under the eyes, as if the page had decided to age me by a year to see whether I would still recognize what I had come to do. I did. Recognition is an addiction with lovely manners. I restored the salt in a ring that was not as perfect as before. The right did not complain. The strap lay quiet. The ledger allowed me one more page, the way a host, ready at last to sleep, pours a guest a final, smaller drink. To bind the future, the page reminded me. Unwrite the past, to hold the flock, shear the shepherd. I had heard those words without letters in my skull weeks earlier. Seeing them set in a hand embarrassed me with the comfort of confirmation. I blew out the candle and stood in the dark until the room and I forgot we had ever been otherwise. On the stair, the bell accommodated me with its 13th. I counted it, not with triumph, but with the bookkeeping sorrow of a man who has learned that his tools have other employers. The basilica slept. Rome invented excuses. The obelisk pinned noon to a future I had begun to distrust. And in my jacket, the pocketbook kept two signatures I dared not show anyone. Vicarious and the outline of a question mark sewn shut. If you are waiting for horns, for smoke, for a beast to announce itself with the manners of a stage entrance, I cannot give you that. I can give you procedure. I can give you a circle of salt that does not melt, and a strap tanned from something all of us produce faithfully every day. I can give you a choir that tunes silence until stone remembers a different century. I can give you ink that knows your face and refuses to be bribed by it. These are the instruments. The symphony waits. Tomorrow, or another mercy day that the basilica will refuse to number, I will tell you about the duplicates, the popes who were not, the saints unmade by tidying, and how the ledger accounted for them with a rudeness so polite it became natural. But for this hour, which is either a 13th or a mercy or a theft, keep what the right kept reminding me. Clocks prefer law. Bells prefer truth. If either begins to love you, you are already lost. The quill-bound ledger did not accuse anyone of heresy. It did something more efficient. It rearranged names. If evil has a wardrobe, it prefers cardigans labeled Index. In the weeks after the mirror ink rite, I learned to recognize the ledger's particular cruelty, the way it could move a life, the distance of a red ribbon, and thereby cancel its weather. The room where duplicates slept was honest about its intent. Diplomata, duplicata, the brass plate declared, with the calm of a hospital, admitting it holds both births and the paperwork for leaving. The drawers were cedar. The scent a suggestion of old pencils and clean grief clung to my sleeves. On the first afternoon I gave to that room, I told myself I was conducting an audit. Cowards, as a rule, prefer the word audit. I began with a pair of bulls separated by 9 months and a day, their calligraphy so kin it could have passed a church paternity test. The first exhorted grain to be generous, the second exhorted blood. Each was signed with a pope who, according to the public catalogue, reigned at opposite edges of a plague. When I laid the sheets side by side, the vellum burred audibly with the friction of their overlap. A hairline difference in the red ribbon dyed with a batch that had more patience. That is all told me which document had been ordained to survive. The ledger's margin had already written the moral. Composite throat, single voice, bind forward for famine, backward for war. I had always been comforted by the catechism line that the church speaks with one voice. That day, I learned to name the seamstress. I took notes the way a man chops vegetables to keep his thumb honest. Pairs multiplied. A bull that promised amnesty if a certain bridge were built next to a bull that promised excommunication if a certain speech were given. Both bulls bore the same cross-hatched flourish at the end of the final sentence, the same accident in the S of Nostra. The ledger's right column accounted for the difference with the kind of cruelty that fits in a spreadsheet. Anniversary repositioned, hunger reassigned, obedience purchased at cost. There was a protocol pinned to the inside of the drawer, formally precise, humanly shameful, titled Vox Unis Procedure. It contained 3 steps. 1. Identify proximate decrees whose moral weather contradicts. 2. Select the copy that will flatter the future event. 3. Stitch the throat. Retire the other voice to mercy stock. To stitch a throat is to ensure the melody leaving it is not troubled by harmony. The word troubled suggests malice. The ledger preferred the vocabulary of hygiene. I moved from popes to saints because curiosity prefers hope as a palate cleanser. Saints are supposed to be hope's currency. I opened Sancti, Translati et Relocati, a cabinet as proud of its woodwork as any reliquary. Inside, feast days that had been harmonized, patronages, clarified, relics, cooled. The language read like a spa menu. The result was frost. On one index card, a woman's saint's care for sailors had been moved 200 miles inland to a town that made good candles and poor weather. Her reliquary, fine silver, a lock shaped like applause, had been relocated with a letter that assured parishioners her influence traveled better when she was close to where wax is born. On another, a patron of plague, lost his name to a newly popular soldier whose iconography included tidier angles for banners. In the ledger, the notes were arid and correct. Cult-cooled contagion fell under arithmetic. Asterisk. Icon clarified, youth morale improved. A third card bore the small violence of red ink. Feast swapped to obscure a coronation. The right column recorded the interest. Local grief lost its anniversary. Obedient gratitude installed. To erase a saint is uncouth. To rename one is civilized. The crypt taught me that civilization prefers erasures in cursive. There are habits you can only acquire by proximity to the rooms that train them. I began to read adornment for its negative space. A reliquary's ribbon told me what story had been unthreaded. A candlestick's placement on a side altar suggested which miracle had been translated into habit. In the Custodia Obelici, where the brass tools made noon behave, I found a docket of corrections, small shifts applied with the modesty of clerks that moved the sun by minutes measured against a shadow's arithmetic. Noon was a virtue, midnight, by those measures, a behavior. When noon is obedient, the custodian's diary insisted, midnight will misplace itself. I thought of all the nights I had given to prayer, to fear, to love. How many had been moved like pawns 2 squares forward and declared honorable by dawn? The ledger supplied no villains in crimson masks. It supplied committees. The veiled eyes choir sang through walls so gently the walls remembered obedience as resonance. The scriptorium of reflections perfected refusal until absence could be read aloud. The custodian of the obelisk granted jubilees out of mercy stock the way a judicious banker extends a line of credit to a client who has always paid on time. If you want a religion to last, you do not feed it monsters, you feed it schedules. There was one shelf I avoided until I could not. Apocrypha. P.V. Blico non ostendenda. The iron grill made modesties of our hands. Inside, chained books breathed the old weather. One volume, bound in a brown that would not agree to be named, bore no title, only the impression of a signet, a lion with its mouth sewn shut. The chain was long enough for a reader to stand, short enough to prevent escape. Not catalogued, Monsignor L. had once said, when he caught my eyes trying to live longer on it than was healthy. Not for you, the ledger disagreed. Its index, an index of absences, not subjects, referred me to the lion by a grocery list of euphemisms. Instrumentum, clarificatum, eventus, harmonizatus, narratio redacta. The book, when I opened it, refused to care about my gloves. It recorded the trial of a woman whose gospel sang in a register that frightened practical men. The trial ended in ash, made to look like wisdom. The ledger's right column called it by its cost. Memory collateralized, curiosity amortized. I closed the cover as if I could orphan the sentence. Monsignor L. appeared in the doorway like a kindness rehearsed. We preserve by curation, he said, his voice polishing the rule until it reflected everyone taller than me. And by omission. Which is mercy, I replied, offering him the catechism he preferred. Of course, he said, and his smile wore a tired father's teeth. A child cannot hold every knife. The basilica does not argue, it arranges. On afternoons, when the square boiled with tourists and the pigeons performed their bureaucracy of flapping, the Custodia Obelici angled noon to flatter a speech, or to spare a funeral the humiliation of shadow, or to align a procession with the impression of heaven's approval. Alignment, read the custodian's manual, is the art of telling the truth where the truth agrees to be measured. I wrote the line down and then taught myself to forget it. Forgetting is an archivist's polite sin. The ledger's cruelty was patient. It rarely wrote a command, It wrote directions in the grammar of weather. If a saint's cult breeds pride, cool the glass. If a scholar's apparatus teaches hunger too fast, translate instrument into relic, award it a case. If two popes speak with two voices, stitch. If one voice strains generosity, choose a throat with more room. When read aloud in the mirror ink, the sentences behaved like laws. When read silently by a coward, they behaved like excuses. I keep telling you about procedures because procedure is how we absolve ourselves of personality. The church speaks with one voice. The catechism whispers. But the voice is a braid. The braid requires hands. The hands are human and get tired and prefer clean lines to messy testimonies. Sitting with the duplicates taught me the tenderness of fraud, the care with which a scribe will mimic the flourish of a colleague's G to keep history from noticing. It has been edited by preference. There were days when I wanted melodrama, a horn in a fresco, a hoofprint in a ledger, a sentence that hissed. The Crypt denied me those pleasures. Instead, it gave me a form titled Formularive Im 27B, Administrative Realignment, used to rename benefactors who had since become inconvenient to the way a city wants to tell its meals. The form had boxes for the date, the reason, the witness, the new title to be affixed to the old bronze plaque. We do not erase, the rubric insisted. We clarify. The right column, if it had existed, would have tallied shame. I carried my shame in the pocketbook I have confessed to. There I wrote, "We prune so the garden looks like it belongs to one season, our season. Mercy is what we call a well-fed omission." I did not show this to anyone. Shame is not useful to the ledger. It resists being budgeted. On a morning that smelled of lime wash and the sweet indifference of old pages, I unlocked a drawer labeled Index OCCLVD and found the index to an index, a list of saints, retired, popes clarified, feasts harmonized. The first entries were centuries old, written by men whose Latin walked like a general. Later entries grew domestic, comfortable with the bureaucratic romance we breathe now. One line stilled my hand. Chant revised to cover absence of feast. Choir instructed to pour surplus certainty into vigil. Surplus certainty. The words embarrassed me with their accuracy. If truth is a ration, some days require topping up. You borrow from the choir. You do not ask how they are paid. The Veiled Eyes Choir became more than payroll to me. Their practice schedule posted in a hand that loved forethought, mapped an obedience that lapped the city like tide. They did not sing notes so much as positions. They tuned the basilica's breath until stone learned how to carry silence as if it were a responsibility. I heard them once, by accident, during an after-hours calibration. The sound was nothing. Inhalation, a palate raised, a collective swallow. Yet the walls altered their degree. The floor consented to hold us all more carefully. You could be forgiven, in such a room, for thinking it an honor to obey. The scriptorium of reflections kept their pencils sharp. They wrote by erasing. Their ledgers of deletion were bound in gray. When the page is asked to tell two stories, one for the mercy stock, one for the feast day, you do not mutilate the page. You nudge. You adjust the tense. You invite a pronoun to speak for a village. You reduce an engine into sacramentum apparatus, and the young will seek awe before they seek instruction. We do not lie. A scribe wrote in a margin I was not meant to see. We domesticate. Domesticating truth is the kind of phrase that gets a man defrocked if he says it at the wrong table. In the Crypt, it earned me my supper. I recorded shipments of ash in an ink that remembered my face, and once I found a receipt acknowledging the retirement of a gospel that had taught me to love the sound of a woman's courage. The receipt called it an act of hygiene. I signed, "I have told you I am not brave. I am sometimes teachable." The ledger's lower corners held a habit of writing that saved me from despair by replacing it with disgust. Here is one such habit. Whenever a saint's name had been renamed, the clerk would draw, very small, a question mark near the new title. Then he would sew it shut with a single red slash. I copied the mark in my pocketbook. When shame threatened to romanticize itself into poetry, I looked at that sewn question and remembered, this is not tragedy. This is policy. On an evening that the obelisk's shadow did something handsome to the pavement, and I considered liking Rome again, I returned to Diplomata, Duplicata, and found a folder misfiled by fortune or complicity. It contained a sequence of bulls belonging to the same month, different years. All signed Vicarious. No personal name, only the office, because offices are designed to outlive sins. Each bull had a twin that dressed the same advice for a different stomach. Together they read like a conversation between a father who believes in rules and a father who believes in affection. The ledger would bind forward or backward as needed. The world, reading afterward, would praise consistency. The last folio in that folder contained something unlike the others. A thin, translucent page stitched in where you might expect a colophon. It mirrored, very faintly, the script on the page before it, but the letters had been combed until they bordered silence. When I leaned, the mirror ink offered my tired eyes back and brought into focus a rubric I had missed. If the divergence between twins grows scandalous, retire both, reissue a single throat. The practice had a name, Concordia, harmony. Who will argue with harmony? Only those who have learned what went missing to afford it. I took the folio to the trestle table where the straps sometimes lay, like a question you are tired of revisiting. Tonight, it was not there. In its place, a note written in the janitor's voice the basilica favors when it wishes to be decent, when the hand wavers, bind with dread. I did not need the strap to feel its grammar. I closed the folio as if to spare it a breeze. The choir rehearsed far above, veils down, tuning the basilica to carry a vigil that would delight tourists into reverence. The bell counted the honest 12, and because truth cannot help itself, one more, the little blush at the edge of a cheek. In that 13th, the ledger's logic achieved an awful elegance. If you can keep an hour no clock records, you can store decisions inside it, like bones under a floor. Later, when the house creaks, you call it weather. I walked the long corridor of saints without names. Their niches had plaques that told attractive stories about local devotion. Each plaque's corners betrayed a previous name's geometry, 2 holes filled, 2 newly drilled. The stone remembers even when policy does not. My hand reached to touch one niche and fell away, as if a good dog had been trained to stay. The impulse to pray has manners. At the exit, where the iron door does its polite violence to air, condensation bloomed for an instant and wrote, "Keep the 13th hour in a child's hand." I wiped it with my sleeve, as if embarrassed for an illiterate. This is how complicity speaks, by tidying. I wish I could say I ran upstairs, burst into Monsignor L's office, threw the ledger into the sun, declared a revolt the newspapers would know how to flatter. Instead, I did what men do who are still bargaining for a dignified way to keep their income and their conscience. I wrote a memorandum. It was measured. It requested clarification on vox unus procedure. It suggested gently, as if moving a vase that duplicate decrees, while administratively convenient, might erode the moral weather. I signed it with a neat hand and placed it where the in-tray makes small saints of paperwork. The memorandum returned 3 days later with a sticky note. Preserve by curation and by omission. The handwriting was elegant enough to be forgiving. A second note, in a less patient hand, added, assign another face to the page if the page has learned yours. Rotations preserve institutions. Men, being men, fail. I slept with the taste of pennies. In my dream, a set of drawers opened and shut, in a rhythm so precise it made a chant. The drawers did not contain documents, they contained seasons. A winter moved from one to another, as if the city had requested a gloom that flattered certain sermons. A summer was shortened to spare a war heatstroke. On waking, I tried to laugh at myself for believing in such domestic apocalypses. The laugh had no place to sit. You want a villain. I am sorry. We have rollers of red ribbon and men who write with a steadiness that could bless a fever. We have a choir that can pitch silence to a key that persuades stone to be kind. We have an obelisk that measures noon like a judge reading the sentence and allows midnight to misplace itself for the good of the city. We have a strap tanned from the only animal we never run out of. We have me, and all my tidy obedience. What I can give you is the hinge. Every door has one. The hinge in this chapter is simple. Once you accept a composite throat as one voice, everything that follows will sound like conscience. The duplicates cease to be scandal. They become service. The saints cease to be people. They become lighting instruments. The calendar ceases to be the sky's diary. It becomes a budget. And budgets can be balanced by moving the debt into a 13th hour no one is required to notice. Tomorrow, if we are allowed a tomorrow, the ledger will admit we will approach the page with the signatures. We will read the Pact, which is less a roar than a policy, less a horn than a fountain pen announcing its intent to be permanent. For now, stand at the edge of the aisle with me and look at the niches. Names replaced by function, functions dressed as mercy. If you feel the air cool the way a room cools when a story is about to choose its ending, keep the hour. Don't let the bell apologize for telling you the truth once too often. The basilica told me when to be alone with it, not by announcement, but by subtraction. A certain hush in the square, a certain cooperation from the weather, a courier delayed by a saint's impatience somewhere along the river. The day appointed for the Pact did not declare itself special to anyone who had not elected to love calendars the way a jailer loves keys. A lunar apogee, one of those modest words that lets the sky act without scandal, had been inked in a small hand on an old schedule kept inside the Custodia Obelici. The obelisk's shadow that afternoon behaved with such clean arithmetic that even the pigeons looked as if they had been measured into the air. Above, the bell rehearsed its conjugations of 12. Below, the crypt kept the temperature of mistakes. I brought nothing I could not deny. Linen gloves, a pocketbook, a candle that had briefly been a part of a mass larger than itself, my own cowardice, combed and buttoned, the sort a polite institution can put to work. The key shapeless, gild-smithed failure promoted to destiny, settled in the door as if the iron had developed a tenderness for it. The hinge sang its wet violin. The corridor installed itself around me. The rite had not moved. That is the cruelty of procedure. It waits with the exactness of furniture. Circle of unmelting salt. Beaker disguised as a chalice. The reed cut for a mouth. The strap that warms even when the world goes thin. The ledger bound in feathers that breathe like a domesticated bird. I drew the circle and hated the way it looked obedient, which is to say, confident it would be forgiven. I placed the ledger in the circle's heart, the way a surgeon arranges a sleeping child's hands before the first careful violence. I set the strap aside and did not touch it. I lit the candle and watched wax rehearse gravity. The mirror ink had learned me too well these last weeks. I could feel it before I opened the book, an eagerness not unlike a cat's, pretending to indifference but betraying its appetite in the twitch of a surface. I opened the quills with a tenderness that embarrassed me and turned to the folio, whose rubric had always refused to hold still beneath light. It held still now. In the small official hand that performs miracles by refusing to adorn them, the heading announced itself: Fotis Chirothecarum, the Pact of the Gloved Hands. The page divided itself into sections as neatly as a man washing his face. Occasion. On nights of lunar apogee, when the 13th hour may be kept without insult to the public day, convene in the lower archive at the trestle, marked with the sentence that refuses to mean the same thing twice. Even the obedience of the instruction threatened to become a liturgy. Witnesses. The choir, the scriptorium, the custodian, and the fourth witness named not by title but by function. Enforcement. No romance, no wit. The strap was not invited. It was assumed. 3. Consideration. This was the section that would later wake me from an unkind sleep. We tender into custody the surplus of human certainty gathered since the previous apogee. In exchange, we receive grace to relocate anniversaries, to reconcile feasts, to crowns, to convert instruments into sacraments, to apportion silence to those who cannot afford it. The sentence performed the elegance that allows empires to sound tender. A transaction stated as a courtesy. Method. Here the manual emptied its pockets. Open the ledger within the circle. Allow the mirror ink to know the faces in attendance. Do not present your faces as argument. Present them as inventory. The choir will tune the room until the walls lift their shoulders. The custodian will unhook the minutes that offend noon. The scriptorium will prepare the erasures through which truth may travel without alarming the faithful. The signer, by office, not by person, will initialize the page. The question, sewn shut, will initial back. I felt my hands choosing between trembling and ceremony. I offered them ceremony. Palms outward, the coward's imitation of courage. My eyes learned their work from the ink. The reed in the beaker remembered breath. The candle took on that particular posture flames adopt when they want to be kind to paper, taller, less fattened by oxygen, as if ashamed of its hunger. The choir did not enter. They arrived. The air acknowledged their discipline. A tone that was not a tone threaded the corridor, aligned the ribs of the arches, persuaded the table to stand as if it liked its job. The silence wore pitch. I could feel each swallow in my own throat answer a number I did not know how to pronounce. Imagine the moment before a cathedral consents to carry a note. Now remove the note. What remains is collaboration. The custodian did not bring his instruments. The obelisk had already done the arithmetic outside. He came with a small ledger of his own, and the calm of men who don't need to raise their voice because the sun works for them. He nodded not at me but at the salt, which had kept its modest circumference all these days like a ring no one had dared take off. "Good," he said, as one tells a chair it has behaved. From the scriptorium, a woman not young, not old, whose voice carried the crispness of erasers. She set a gray-bound book beside mine and opened it to a page that contained almost nothing. The nothing arranged itself in elegant lines. It felt like standing before a winter lake and being asked to recite the names of those who fell through its ice before anyone agreed to call the surface dangerous. Behind us, or above us, or through us, the crypt resists prepositions. Monsignor L. stood with the posture of a man who had taught generations to love neatness. He did not participate in the rite so much as permit it to scold him into invisibility. That is what good superiors do. They disappear where they are most themselves. The page flared and then corrected itself. Mirror ink prefers humility in its readers. The rubric settled again, and the section I had avoided, the one titled Deposit and Disbursement, began to read itself through me. Surplus certainty, the line repeated, is gathered from processions, from sermons that performed too well, from miracles repeated into laws, from anniversaries that have grown fat. It is not healthy for the public. It is not healthy for the shepherds either. It must be banked. The ledger becomes a cistern. I could taste the iron of the metaphor. Cisterns do not ask if the rain confesses belief. I understood the economy at last, not as a metaphor, but as plumbing. Certainty accumulates like pressure. Without pressure relief, the pipes sing, the walls crack. The children learn their parents' nerves by ear. The church, in its administrative genius, had built a pressure valve under Street Peters. Open on the apogee. Bleed the surplus. Spend the quiet where it will do the least harm. Buy obedience at cost. I held this understanding like a cup I suspected of a hairline crack. Then the signing began. Vicarious the office, not the man, appeared first as a signature, practiced until it forgot the hand that learned it. It wore no flourish. It was a jawline of ink. It belonged where it had always belonged, under sentences that preferred eternity to biography. I could not tell which pope had stood here in which century. The office is a mask that fits whoever feeds it breath. The second signature I had met before in shire circumstances, the contour that only ink can resolve when it decides to be your mirror, the outline of a question mark sewn shut. It did not belong to a person. It belonged to a habit. If you can suture a question, you can harvest silence like wool. The outline brightened in the mirror ink, acknowledged us all with the discourtesy of a necessary colleague, then steadied, as if insisting, I am not here to be loved. My name did not belong on the page. I am a clerk. My reward is to be unremembered. But the rite required a witness signature from the rank of hands. And Monsignor L's finger, exquisitely clean from a lifetime of avoiding blame, indicated me without malice. I signed with the modesty of a man signing a receipt for a delivery he did not order. A small name practiced legibility. A letter that always betrays to a teacher where a boy first loved the shape of language. The mirror ink returned my face as if to say, we know who you are pretending to be. The choir inhaled. The room consented to be a single instrument. The custodian raised his little book and unhooked 3 minutes from the day with the gentle wrist of a man letting a bird out of his house. The scriptorium scribed a line that was more absence than graphite, and in that absence drafted the shape of a new feast, stolen politely from an old grief. The ledger, the feathered ledger at the circle's heart, received these transactions with the courtesy of a bank teller who never asks the source of wealth. I had expected spectacle. I received accounting. Each line that left the public world and entered the mercy stock left a small draft behind it, the way a body knows when a pint of blood has been loaned. Processions lost exactly the amount of certainty they could afford without falling into honesty. Speeches will later be praised for their sobriety. Laughing children will laugh a little less loudly at a fountain they cannot name. The ledger kept the numbers. In the right column, interest, paid in silence. In smaller hand, unrepeatable, except by the complicit, principal, collected in fear. I stared at that last line until all the room's smaller grammars, pitch, shadow, wax, demanded I distribute my attention more fairly. Fear is a blunt word. The ledger meant not panic, but the slender fear well-brought-up people feel at the brink of questions whose answers will rearrange their furniture. The fear of being unmothered by your calendar. The fear of pronouncing a name that isn't there anymore and hearing the stone say nothing back. The strap waited. The right had not asked for it yet. The page paused. Pages do have pauses. Believe a man who has loved them long, and the choir let their held breath out with the decorum of an usher. The custodian ticked a box to acknowledge a line item called Jubilee Alignment. The scriptorium produced a deletion that would someday be praised as a clarifying edit. Then the ledger hesitated in the manner of tools that possess too much conscience and not enough power to disobey. Bind, Monsignor L. said as one suggests a sweater to a child who refuses to admit winter. He did not look at me when he said it. That is how men save one another's faces. I took the strap. The cold that rose along my fingers did not punish. It corrected. It reminded my bones that there exists a temperature at which metaphor converts back into meat. The strap's stipple tightened, not like skin, more like a surface learning its job. I wrapped it around the ledger with an economy I wish I had not learned to admire. The quills nested. The spine remembered storms. The book, secured, exhaled a breath too small for dignity. The mirror ink-steadied. A sentence that had been shivering because it preferred to be honest resumed its administrative gait. When I unbound, the page offered the Pact's sanctions in a clerk's unsentimental diction. If any face attempts to remove from mercy stock an hour the Church has purchased, that face will lose the privilege of recognition. Mirrors will not know it. Bells will not give it the 13th. Calendars will kneel when it enters a room and then stand as if no one has arrived. I laughed without sound. I know what it means for a face to go unfurnished by mirrors. It is not haunting, it is hunger. We do not look into mirrors to admire ourselves. We look because identity is a privacy that requires confirmation. To be unmirrored is to be homeless. The basilica knows what deprivations mend men to institutions. The allowances followed, as if the clerk wished to use generosity to rinse the taste of sanction from our mouths. For the choir, 3 measures from mercy stock when stone is stubborn. For the scriptorium, 1 incident per generation to redate by unanimous hum. For the custodian, up to 2 hours to calibrate jubilees, such that noon renders midnight harmless. The numbers felt small, the way salaries feel small when you know the office has a private budget for favors. But the very smallness argued permanence. Systems that spend modestly last longer. There was a paragraph unassuming, easy to miss, entitled, On the Public Day. We will not insult the public day, it read, by bringing the 13th openly into its company. The bell may confess once, the clock will not. We will keep the hour in trust, and return to the city a quiet that looks like maturity. Children must not be handed every knife. You hear the tenderness dressing the theft. You hear the theft teaching the tenderness how to walk. At the bottom of the page, in the scribe's smaller, slightly shamed hand, a question. What is given in exchange? Not the institution's question, a person's. For the first time that night, the ledger answered without policy. The mirror ink darkened, and in that darkness a shape took place that was less a word than a confession collecting enough bones to stand. We surrender the right to remember freely. The choir did not gasp. They had been paid to know. The custodian's pencil paused a fraction of a second, the patience of a metronome missing a tooth. The scriptorium lifted her eyes, and then lowered them the way one pins a butterfly, exact and gentle and lethal. I felt the sentence settle on me like a dust that is older than a building. The right to remember freely. The way you remember your mother's hand without needing to check a photograph. The way you remember the smell of the room where you first learned to pronounce mercy. The way a city remembers its uprisings, even when the plaques belong to princes. We were bartering that right for order. The apogee does its work in the background. The moon, decently far, allows the water in you to rest from its temptations. The room eased. The ink, having taken its tithe of our faces, grew polite again. The deposit and disbursement columnations ended with a flourish so small it felt like a nod. Monsignor L. said, "We preserve by curation," which is to say, Amen in a language of drawers. Someone I could not tell who began to close the ledger. The quills rose to meet the touch, a flock trained to love the aviary. The strap lay like a sentence I would not be able to unsay. The salt circle kept its courage. The candle's pool trembled in the draught that found us. Then the draught that has always found us. Then and the iron door at the head of the corridor glazed itself in breath. From the inside out, a child's hand wrote, "Keep the 13th hour." It is a weary refrain, I know, but weariness is one of the ways a truth tries to survive men who prefer variety. When I lifted the ledger to carry it back to its shelf, the mirror ink climbed my cuticles the way ivy learns what masonry intends. My left hand there is always a hand that confesses first carried letters that would not commit to legibility. It looked as if a sentence were trying to take place on my skin without the indignity of vowels. I tucked the hand inside my jacket like a contraband heart. We adjourned, that is the word, the scriptorium wrote later in a neat column. Adjourned at a minute the day will not receive. The choir unpitched the stone. The custodian rehooked his minutes to the public calendar with the tenderness of a father rebuttoning a child's coat after a reprimand. Monsignor L. placed a palm on the trestle, as if thanking furniture for not becoming an animal while our backs were turned. I should have left with them. I should have practiced whatever virtue keeps a clerk in the warm mathematics of consent. Instead, I did the thing cowards do when they have mistaken curiosity for redemption. I tried to take a copy, only a leaf, only a transcription of consideration, the part that confessed the trade. I would hide it in my pocketbook and look at it later the way a boy looks at a photograph he has stolen from a library because he liked the way it believed him into existence. I reached, and the page permitted my pencil the way a tolerant aunt permits a child to play with her kitchen clock. I wrote, We surrender the right to remember freely. The graphite sat on the paper with an insolence it had not earned. On the stair, time elongated. It became a gentleman with rules, and a headmaster with a cane. The steps unrolled like ribbon cut too thin. My breath, which had behaved for the choir, turned into furniture in a house being rearranged by a stranger. I held the rail, and felt the iron prefer someone else. The door did not grow. The distance to it acquired manners. I reached the corridor, and the tapestry whose saints no longer have eyes. The key considered refusing me. It indulged me instead, and in that indulgence I recognized the danger of being liked by doors. The corridor sat in its posture of apology. The clock on the archivist's desk reported the time like a witness who has practiced forgetting under oath. The bell in the south transept offered 12, then one more as if to apologize to me personally for the cooperation it has rendered for centuries. At my desk, my hand trembled in a way that embarrassed the ink. I opened the pocketbook to the sentence I had copied, the one I had decided would be my private revolt. The words had rearranged themselves. Not erased administrations rarely erase. They persuade. The line now read, "We surrender the right to remember publicly." An adverb had smuggled itself into the difference between salvation and bookkeeping. Someone had domesticated my defiance. It took the scriptorium's kind of genius to make that theft look like an edit. I went to the sink. The water tasted like 19th century pipe and the patience of a city that has learned not to scream every time it feels a knife. I washed my hands until the soap argued with me. The letters did not leave. They become more diffident and therefore more difficult to confess to anyone else. That is how stains survive in polite company. In my room, the diary The Coward's Ledger received a line I cannot retract even now. The Pact is not a roar. It is a policy. It does not bargain for souls. It leases memory from those too tired to keep it. In exchange, it gives us a calendar that does not fight in public. I sat a long time with that sentence, until my lamp forgot to pretend it was a candle. Outside, Rome attempted sleep, and then remembered itself. A scooter performed penance. Someone sang a kindness out of tune. The obelisk, devoted to noon, stood guard over a midnight that had misplaced itself on our behalf. My window glass misted briefly, and there, for a moment I could have denied later, appeared the little hand again. "Keep the 13th hour." I wiped it with the back of my wrist, and my wrist wrote back in letters my skin had not volunteered. You will ask whether I considered running, or publishing, or kneeling at the Pope's shoe and presenting him with the strap so that he might see what his officials had acquired with their competence. I considered all of it the way a boy considers punching a rainstorm. I lacked not courage, but a plan that would not make me into the kind of scandal the ledger could solve with a mercy afternoon and a newly harmonized feast. The institution had anticipated me for centuries. It had even provided pity. A rotation could assign someone else's face to the page, and the mirror ink would forget me as a kindness. That is the most frightening mercy a bureaucracy can offer. The mercy of being relieved of your reflection. I slept briefly and badly, my mouth full of the pennies men pay to the god of good order. I woke with the taste still there, and the knowledge that Chapter 6, what I would call What They Fear Most, was already writing itself in the part of my head where prayer pretends to be thought. I will speak it tomorrow, in a voice I hope still remembers how to be ordinary. It will not demand your belief. It will require your noticing. For now, I will tell you only this. If ever you feel your calendar kneel when you enter a room, and then stand as if no one had arrived. If ever a bell offers you 12, and then blushes into 13 and you are tempted to forgive it for its honesty, if ever a page returns your face and asks, without moving its mouth, whether you intend to keep it hold the hour. Keep it like contraband. Keep it like breath. The most dangerous thing for them is not scandal. It is mnemonic revolt, memory, return to the wrong people at the wrong time, which is to say, to you, now. The candle lowers itself. The corridor breathes. The hinge rehearses its weeping. The ledger sleeps with fear's strap nearby, a pet that cannot die so long as men are obedient and tired. I did not leave the priesthood for hatred. Hatred is a blunt instrument. It breaks only what was already cracking. I left because a page looked back at me and, very politely, asked whether I intended to keep my face. To keep a face, one must keep a memory. To keep a memory, one must refuse certain trades, even when those trades are tenderly worded and administered by men who smell like cedar. The morning after the Pact, Rome rehearsed innocence. Street sweepers laced the alleys with water until the cobbles believed in baptism again. A barista tamped coffee like a sacrament. On the piazza, a guide lifted a small flag and shepherded strangers toward a photograph that would later edit the heat out and leave only the blue. The obelisk, dutiful to noon, cast a rehearsal shadow across pigeons that had learned patience from empires. I should have been comforted by the city's competence. Instead, every angle whispered inventory. In my pocketbook, the sentence I had stolen from the ledger, the simple confession of what the Pact purchased, had acquired the adverb that turned revolt into policy. We surrender the right to remember publicly. An edit so hygienic it made treason look like housekeeping. I closed the book and felt under my fingers the pressure of all the drawers that would close after me if I allowed the edit to stand as law. You would like me to tell you that I ran, that I lit a bonfire under the obelisk and fed it with files until the square awoke to the smell of old glue and fresher disobedience. I did not. My disobedience arrived the way the Crypt taught me truth arrives, by adjusting attention. I walked the basilica and tried an experiment a child would understand. I pointed at things and asked aloud and softly, "What is missing?" at the font. A plaque celebrating the donor's name in letters that had forgiven themselves their serifs. Missing. The name before the administrative realignment, the one that paid for the marble because a daughter had lived 6 months and the summer had not cooperated. At the side altar, where a soldier saint posed at an angle, mathematically hospitable to banners. Missing. The plague-ridden caregiver whose feast had once sat here like a candle in a window. In the nave, where the failed magnifying lenses hung like moons. Missing. The curious apprentices who had been taught to call optics a distraction from prayer. Above me, the bell rehearsed 12 dignified notes, and then, because truth is impolite, only to lies one more, a blush in bronze. I returned to my desk and found the reply to my memorandum. It wore the 2 sentences that wash 1,000 hands clean: we preserve by curation and by omission. A third hand, impatient, had added, assign another face to the page. It was an offer of erasure disguised as rest. Rotations preserve institutions. Men, being men, fail. I understood then why the strap was warm. Fear is the only animal we can tan indefinitely, because we breed it in-house. So I wrote another memorandum, this one not to a superior but to a listener I had not yet met. You, perhaps, I wrote it with the cadence the choir had given my breath, and the discipline the scriptorium had trained into my eyes, and the patience the custodian had taught my clocks. I wrote, "If a saint's name disappears, ask which grief lost its anniversary. If a jubilee is moved, ask what crown needed shade. If a miracle becomes a law, count the repetitions until awe turns into management. If a page returns your face, keep it. Do not rent it to an office." I did not send it. Some letters ask for a different envelope. That evening, I returned to the crypt with no plan a lawyer would approve. The tapestry's blind saints lifted as if they had rehearsed this gesture with me in another century. The door's hinge tuned its wet violin. On the trestle, the quill-bound ledger rested the way certain animals rest, pretending sleep so as not to embarrass the hunter. The circle of salt was as I had left it, an obedience with good posture. The strap lay coiled, warm to the eye, the color of a bruise that had decided to be permanent. I did not break the circle. I stepped over it with the indiscretion of a man who knows that lines protect only those who respect their authors. I opened the ledger and turned to the page where the Pact had confessed more than policy, where it had admitted the price, our right to remember freely. The mirror ink lifted my face with the resignation of a clerk late to supper. The sentence appeared, orderly as ever. I whispered it once, "We surrender the right to remember freely," and the room filed the whisper in a drawer where whispers become law. Then I did the only unprofessional thing left to me. I wrote in the ledger's margin. I did not write an argument. Arguments are the scriptorium's sport. I wrote a question and refused to sew it shut. To whom does memory belong? The ink considered me. The page considered the ink. The choir absent, yet present in the way a corridor learns to breathe, aligned the air until my question stood like a small animal on a table set for carnivores. The page did not strike the question through. It underlined it once, and, with the impatience of a teacher who still likes his least promising student, wrote beside it, "Keep the 13th hour," a kindness, perhaps, or a warning disguised as kindergarten. The 13th hour is not a superstition. It is the seam between consent and memory. You keep it by refusing to let the day balance without the truth that will not fit inside it. The church had built a cistern under Street Peters for surplus certainty. I would build, in the space of an hour no clock could offer me, a cistern for surplus questions. The strap shifted. Not movement. Movement is for beasts, but a change of temperature along my wrist where shadow keeps its most accurate records. I touched it a last time and let the cold climb my bones until the taste of pennies rinsed my mouth clean of apology. When the hand wavers, bind with dread, the right had commanded. I let my hand waver and did not bind. I wanted the ledger to tremble. Trembling is a way paper tells the truth. Above, a door coughed. Footsteps, the tempo of someone who has lived long enough with drawers to trust their arithmetic. Monsignor L. entered without entering, the way a superior's shadow precedes his counsel. He looked at the strap, and then at my hands, and then at the question in the margin. His mouth considered 3 sentences and spared us all by choosing none. "You know what we fear," he said at last, and to his credit, he did not make it a sermon. Not scandal. Scandal feeds calendars. We fear mnemonic revolt. The phrase had been waiting for a mouth. In his, it sounded not like doctrine but like a father warning a child about a storm the family never names. Mnemonic revolt. Memory returning to the wrong people at the wrong time. Memory refusing to be calendared. Memory refusing to kneel when a room asks it to behave. "Will you keep the hour?" he asked, almost gently. "I will try," I said, and knew at once the poverty of the verb. He nodded with the tiredness of carpenters at dusk. "Then do not be theatrical," he said. "Theatrical men are easy to fold into a file. Be dull as a ledger. Write what furniture cannot forget." He left me with the strap warm enough now that the pitch of the room lowered half a key. I closed the ledger. I extinguished the candle with the pinch that never stops feeling like a sin. I climbed the stairs and listened for the bell's apology. It came 12, then the soft 13th that has always sounded like a throat changing its mind about telling the truth. What followed were not heroics, but instructions. First, learn the geography of omissions. If a plaque's corners betray an older geometry, ask the stones what name they knew first. Stone is slow, but it is not forgetful. It remembers screw holes the way skin remembers rings. If a feast migrates, locate the anniversary it displaced. The displaced memory will haunt a different day, like a smell that will not name itself. If a miracle repeats until it becomes a law, count repetitions as you would count breaths in a crypt. Where the count hiccups, there is a 13th. Second, befriend bells. Clocks prefer law. Bells prefer truth. A clock will tell you what hour men agreed to keep. A bell will, once in a decent while, confess to an hour that refuses to be owned. I am not asking you to haunt bell towers like a sentimental ghost. I am asking you to notice when sound performs honesty by accident. Third, cultivate questions that refuse stitches. You need not write them in mirror ink. Write them on receipts, on recipe cards, in the margins of tourist maps, in your phone if you must. But write. A question sewn shut becomes policy. A question left open is a candle that outlives a procession. Fourth, practice small disobediences of attention. When a guide says, "Look here," let your gaze lag a heartbeat and look there. When a caption insists, "This is the important object," examine its shadow for the outline of what refused to be labeled. When a superior says, "We omit to protect," ask whom the omission protects from whom. Dull questions, repeated carefully, erode granite. Fifth, keep witnesses who do not require your agreement. The choir tuned stone. You may tune a room by gathering 2 or 3 minds that do not want the same conclusion, but want an honest paragraph. Sit with them in untheatrical light. Align your breathing until you can hear one another's reluctance. Memory prefers to return in company. Sixth, do not let your rage be harvested. The scriptorium knows how to weave anger into a banner that flatters the men you wish to trouble. Anger is expensive. They will purchase it and print it on a feast day. Keep, instead, a slow contempt for edits that make thefts look like housekeeping. Keep an appetite for dates and names and the way a city smells before rain. Keep your ledger of small accuracies. Institutions outlast storms. They are undone by mildew. Seventh, love the ordinary. The Pact thrives on fatigue. It rents from us the right to remember because most of us would like, for a handful of quiet, to be relieved of the work. Fight by liking your life. Wash the cup. Learn the neighbor's name before the administrative realignment retitles his door. Plant a date on a memory like a flag and visit it The 13th hour belongs to those who have the patience to live 12 of them honestly. This is not a manifesto. It is a maintenance schedule. You will ask whether the Church will forgive me for saying so. The Church forgives by preserving what can be preserved and omitting what would cause the children to cut themselves. It will forgive me if forgiveness becomes administratively convenient. It will forget me if forgetting keeps the weather mild. I do not require its vengeance or its absolution. I require only a bell that sometimes blushes into 13, and a page that declines to sew my question shut. On my last day in the office, though I did not yet call it last, I gave the drawers a careful inventory and left a note that no form could absorb. I wrote it on ordinary paper in unremarkable ink. I placed it not in a file, but under a blotter, where water stains keep their anniversaries. It said, "If you must move a feast, write the name of the grief you displaced on the underside of the plaque. If you must clarify a pope, keep the twin in a drawer labeled with the day you made the throat one. If you must translate an instrument into a sacrament, leave a diagram under the reliquary the way a father leaves instructions taped to the back of a radio. Make forgetting expensive." I do not know if anyone found the note or whether it migrated, as most decencies do, into the mercy stock. I packed a small bag the way a man packs to visit a mother he has disappointed. 2 shirts, a book that did not look back, the pocketbook with the shame I had decided to keep. Before I left, I went once more to the obelisk and stood in its noon. The shadow drew me a line. The pigeons did their bureaucratic work. Rome committed the sin of being beautiful. The bell counted 12, and late, shy, almost a secret between us, offered me the 13th. I accepted it the way a priest accepts the host from a child who has learned the choreography but not yet the theology. On trains and in rooms that smelled less like cedar and more like lives, I began to tell the story the way I have told it to you, slowly, without horns, with the vocabulary of drawers. Men prefer monsters. They are easier to exile. I gave them budgets and calendars instead. I taught them to hear the difference between a clock and a bell. I asked them to keep an hour that no one would thank them for keeping. Some laughed. A few listened. 1 or 2 wrote their questions on receipts and did not sew them shut. At night, when the room forgets to be brave and remembers to be honest, I sometimes see, on the window glass, a child's hand draw the sentence the crypt learned to write with its breath. Keep the 13th hour. I wipe it away not to dismiss it, but to invite it back. If it returns, I know the pact has not taken the whole of me. I have not given you proof that would satisfy a courtroom. Courts are clocks. They prefer law. I have given you bells, glimpses, drafts, shadows that carry arithmetic, and a method to keep company with the seam in the day where memory refuses to be domesticated. If you require scandal, you will miss the hinge. If you require fire, you will overlook the ash that tells you what the fire decided to believe. So take this as your liturgy, paired to its candor. When the calendar kneels for you and then stands as if no one arrived, write the date on your knuckles and keep it for yourself. When a saint's niche wears a plaque that sounds too much like a slogan, ask the stone for its old screw holes. When a guide says, "Here is the miracle," find the instrument under the glass and ask for the diagram. When a sermon repeats until it stops feeling like risk, count the repetitions and name the law. When a bell blushes into 13, do not clap. Do not tweet. Do not make it an anthem. Nod to it the way you nod to a tired friend and keep the hour like bread in your coat. Do not stop asking. The most dangerous thing for them is memory returning not to the archives that can curate it, but to you. In the middle of a day the clock insists is ordinary. Keep one question unstitched, the way a monk keeps a candle no one sees. If a child asks, "Why did they move the feast?" teach the child to answer, "To cover a crown." And then teach the child to ask which widow's dinner went cold. If a friend sighs and says, "This is how it has always been," offer him a receipt with a date on it and an omission written in pencil. Pencil is a sacrament of forgiveness that ink cannot manage. I was ordained at 27 and unmade by 33. Between those numbers lay an hour no clock could carry. I have kept it as best I can. I give it to you now, not as evidence, not as entertainment, but as a tool you may carry into rooms that prefer their furniture untroubled. Use it to pry up a corner of a rug where the house whispers. Use it to measure the distance between a plaque and the holes it hides. Use it to teach your face to belong to you and not to the office that would rent it for the cost of quiet. If you sleep, let this be the last sentence that walks you to shore. Silence is not sacred unless freely chosen. Elsewhere beneath domes and drawers, and the grammar of good intentions it is enforced. You are permitted to remember. You are permitted to keep an hour that will not be thanked. Keep it anyway. The bell will tell you when. 12, and then almost sorry, almost brave one more.